Yesterday, I had the honor of sitting down with the main plaintiff behind the NDAA case, Hedges versus Obama, Mr. Chris Hedges himself. He's a former New York Times war correspondent and Pulitzer Prize winner who spent nearly 2 decades reporting in Central America, the Middle East, Africa, and the Balkans. Despite his prolific resume of outstanding journalism, Hedges is precisely the kind of person that could fall subject to NDAA's indefinite detention clause. You see, Chris represents one of many journalists who often have to embed themselves with groups that the government has deemed terrorists to get the full story. So take a look at my exclusive interview with journalist Chris Hedges, where he talks about the lawsuit and why every American should care about it. Chris, thanks so much for sitting down with me. Why is the government holding this line that the NDAA is no different than a AUMF when it's obviously much more broad in its language?
Well, that was the central argument that the government lawyers made in the Southern District Court of New York, that this was essentially not extending the powers of the government, but reinforcing existing powers. Now, I've read the AUMF several times. It's very clear that this is a vast extension of government authority, allowing government to detain U.S. citizens or use the military to detain U.S. citizens, strip them of due process, hold them in military facilities indefinitely. That is just not in the AUMF. And I think that we're seeing, and we just saw the release of a memo, 16-page white paper on drone attacks, which looks like it was written by a first-year law student. I mean, I can't stand John Yoo, but at least he could write a coherent legal brief for the Bush administration justifying torture. I mean, it's wrong, of course, but the amateurness of this, it's a completely amateur effort. And I think what we're seeing in this case, in this memo, is an attempt by the Obama administration to justify activities that they've already carried out, which include the assassination of American citizens, the Yemeni cleric Anwar al-Awlaki, his 16-year-old son 2 weeks later, who was not on anybody's terrorism list. And I think there's I have a strong suspicion, and the lawyers have a strong suspicion, that they are already using Section 1021 of the NDAA. Because when Judge Forrest issued her ruling in September, the government attorneys, the day of the ruling, went to Judge Forrest and asked for a temporary stay, meaning put this law back on the books until it is heard in the Second Circuit or the appellate court. Now, Judge Forrest refused. They then demanded an emergency hearing, this was a Friday, at 9 a.m. the next Monday morning at the Second Circuit, which they got. And they asked the judges on the Second Circuit, in the name of national security, to put this law back into effect, to override Judge Forrest's injunction. Now, the Second Circuit agreed. We always knew the Obama administration would appeal. That was not an issue if they lost. We did not expect them to respond so aggressively. And I think that it's fair to conclude that they responded with that kind of aggressivity because they're already using the law, probably against U.S.-Pakistani dual nationals in places like Bagram. If Judge Forrest's injunction was allowed to stand, i.e. the law was invalid, and they were holding American citizens and denying them due process, then of course they would be in contempt of court. So this is a steady march forward in terms of stripping away our most basic civil liberties. I would say the NDAA, this case, is the last thin line of defense between what's left of our anemic democracy and our transformation into a military state.
Speaking of military states, I mean, I thought posse comitatus prevented the military from doing this kind of thing.
Well, this is the law they're overturning.
Wow.
That's it. It was put into effect at the end of the Civil War, and this is the law they're overturning.
Chris, how far are you willing to take this?
Well, we're going to take it. Look, if the appellate court overturns Judge Forrest's ruling, we will appeal it to the Supreme Court, which is the next level. The Supreme Court, could decide not to take the case, in which case, unfortunately, the law stands. If the appellate court upholds Judge Forrest's ruling, given the response of the government so far, I think it's very safe to say that this will be within the Supreme Court within a matter of weeks.
And just taking it in the broader picture here, you know, Obama closing the office that's working to shut down Guantanamo Bay within days of his reelection. Why don't we care more about the indefinite detention of human beings in general?
Well, what happens in these kinds of scenarios is that you create the legal mechanism to carry out these activities while assuring the citizenry that they won't be affected. And then once you have the legal mechanism to engage in this kind of behavior, it's too late. And I mean, history has just borne that out. That's how it works. I think the other thing is that we have especially a commercial electronic media that really doesn't do journalism anymore. It is either obsessed with celebrity gossip and trivia and info entertainment, or if it purports to do news the way Fox News does or MSNBC, it's so partisan in its coverage that it won't harm the power interests that it serves. So the NDAA case was never mentioned on MSNBC because the primary purpose of MSNBC was to re-elect Barack Obama, and the NDAA case would not make Obama look good. It wasn't mentioned on Fox because Fox, this section of the NDAA has bipartisan support, and it's interesting. I worked for the New York Times for 15 years. That the only established news organization that responsibly covered the case was the New York Times. And when Judge Forrest issued a ruling, the New York Times ran an editorial supporting her decision. Because the Times still, I mean, it's an elitist organization, and I have my critiques of the Times, but nevertheless, it still understands what is news and what is not. But that, for me, was a kind of frightening moment, because I realized how deteriorated our systems of information have become.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I love how people say, oh, there's no bipartisan support. Well, look at things like the NDAA and the erosion of civil liberties. It seems like it's all uniform across the board. But speaking historically, you mentioned this is the way it's kind of been of accepting these illegalities in terms of Gitmo. But looking at when civil liberties have been repealed in the historical narrative of America, in the short, brief history of our nation, Lincoln, FDR, you know, when he authorized the brief internment of Japanese people, I mean, all of these things were very brief periods, and they were reinstated. It seems like to have the NDAA 10 plus years after an event where there's really no threat, I mean, and now it's coupled with the surveillance state profiting off the erosion of our civil liberties. Well, I mean, how are we way too far gone here?
Right, you're talking about periods of emergency in which our basic civil liberties were taken from us during wartime, which is not defensible. What we're talking about here is something else. We're talking about a long, contiguous process over a decade. This isn't the first assault against our civil liberties. The corporate state has used 9/11 in the same way that the Nazi Party used the Reichstag fire as a justification to strip away all of our most important constitutional rights, whether that is the right or you know, the need of a court to issue a warrant before surveillance, whether that is the right of a whistleblower to expose government crimes, including torture. And we just saw the CIA official Kiriako go to prison for 30 months. What he purportedly leaked to the New York Times were war crimes, and the interpretation of the Authorization to Use Military Force Act is giving the government the right. This is what this white paper that was leaked to NBC News was about, giving the right of the executive branch to draw up kill lists, even if U.S. citizens are on those kill lists. I mean, so we're talking about a process, not a moment. And the examples that you cited, Lincoln's suspending of habeas corpus during the Civil War and FDR's internment of 110,000 Japanese Americans, were moments. This is something far more dire, far more serious, and far more frightening. You mentioned in the hearing about how this could affect journalists abroad who are embedded trying to get stories. Talk about just how this can be a chilling effect for people who are trying to get truths and expose stories abroad. Right. Well, Bruce and Carl, the lawyers, approached me to be the plaintiff because, as a foreign correspondent for 20 years, I spent time, we counted them up, with either 17 individuals or groups that are on the State Department terrorism list, including al-Qaeda. And there's no exemption in this provision for journalists. So I have literally sat in vehicles with al-Qaeda members who are now spending the rest of their lives in prison. Number one, of course, that means, given the current state of drone attacks, I could have been incinerated. And number two, if I am printing, as I was, articles that present the viewpoint of groups that are deeply hostile to the United States, have I substantially supported, this is the language of 1021, al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or what they call associated forces? That's completely open to interpretation. And people who have a kind of hostility to the role of a free press, which is to prevent or present viewpoints that are inimical to our own, certainly would not shrink from branding me as a fifth columnist or a closet supporter of al-Qaeda. And I speak from experience. I covered the civil war in El Salvador and Nicaragua for 5 years during the Reagan administration. And because we were traveling frequently with the FMLN rebels in El Salvador or the Sandinistas in the battle against the Contras in Nicaragua, we had numerous officials within Washington denouncing us as fifth columnists, as supporters of terrorists. So I've already heard the rhetoric. I already know how it goes down. But this essentially goes beyond rhetoric and empowers the state not only to brand you linguistically a terrorist, but treat you legally as a terrorist.
This is an issue that we felt important enough to cover and dedicate the entire show to. Look, there's a fork in the road right now, and there's a choice we all have to make. We can either relinquish our rights or we can stand for them. But the time to act is now. I also want to say thank you to many great people for making today's show happen. Sparrow Project's Annie Stepanian, the plaintiffs and attorneys in the case, Chris Hedges, Tangerine Bolin, Alexa O'Brien, and of course, Jesselyn Raddick and Thomas Drake, as well as all of the brave, heroic activists and journalists out there who are not afraid to speak truth to power. So let's keep doing it.